What's up, guys? I pray you have a blessed day so far. Today we're going to be discussing the question, why is it that David was such a great worshiper? When we look at the book of Psalms, which is basically a huge book of the Bible, completely filled with worship songs to the Lord, which gives us a good understanding that worship is a big issue in Psalms, considering it has one of the largest books of the Bible is considered basically just a worship book, a book filled with worship songs to the Lord. And in this book, we find that David is the largest contributor. He's such a large contributor. The 73 chapters or the 150 chapters of the book of Psalms is attributed completely to him. Now, I want you to take note of that, because in reality, when we look at the 73, that's almost in half of the entire book. And most people, if you look at the book of Psalms, you start thinking that is the biggest book of the Bible. In truth, it's really amongst the top three. It may not necessarily be the biggest book of the Bible, but it's up there. And David was one of the largest contributors. Many actually point to David's contribution in Psalms to being the fact why he was such a good worshiper. He just had a lot of practice. And even though it touches on the subject slightly, in truth, it's not the complete answer to why he was such a good worshiper. In truth, a more complete answer to the fact that David was a good worshiper is the fact that he actually lived a life of worship, to the point that he was called a man after God's own heart. Now, this being the case, we need to ask the question, what is it to live a life of worship? Maybe we've heard this at some point in our lives. Maybe it was preached to us at some point. Maybe we thought about it. Maybe we've looked it up in Scripture. But in most cases, for many people, including to myself for a long while, a life of worship is something almost like not fully well answered. It's almost like a vague term with no clear definitions. But the truth is, if we look at the life of David, we can find a very, very good definition of what it means to live a life of worship. Okay? First thing first, as we look at the life of David to try to answer this, the first thing we will ever have to look at is the very concept that David's entire worship routine, the entire life of worship that he lived, was centered at its core in the heart of David. After all, David is known as a worshiper so great that he is a man after God's own heart. In other words, his heart was one that went after God's own heart. But what exactly does this mean? Many of us have heard this. Maybe of us, if you have ever grown up in the church or ever even been in church and heard a sermon of David, probably at some point heard the concept that David is a man after God's own heart. When we look at Scripture, David's very first mention ever was actually in the curse of Saul as a man after God's own heart in 1 Samuel 13, 11 through 14, where Saul had messed up. God basically comes up and tells him, hey, I'm done with you. Now I'm going to find a man after my own heart. And God sends him to David. God sends Nathan, the prophet, to David and anoints David as the next king in place of Saul. We even see Paul point out the very reason why Jesus Christ was born from his line is because he was a man after God's own heart, and this is why he would do anything for that Lord desired. In Acts chapter 13, 16 to 23, which states as follows. Standing up, Paul mentioned with his hand and said, fellow Israelites and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me. The God of the people of Israel shows our ancestors he made the people prosper during their stay in Egypt. With mighty power he led them out of the country. For about 40 years he endured their conduct in the wilderness, and he overthrew 7 nations in Canaan, giving their land to his people as their inheritance. All this took place over about 450 years. After this, God gave them judges until the time of Samuel the prophet. Then the people asked for a king, and he gave them Saul, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, who ruled 40 years After removing Saul, as we mentioned previously, because of Saul's errors, he made David the king. God testified concerning him, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. From this man's descendants, God has brought to Israel the Savior, Jesus, as he promised. Before the coming of Jesus, John preached a repentance of baptism to all the people of Israel. And you continue on, and he continues to connect this to the very concept of our salvation. The very truth, this was part of the lineage. But we take notice of something that says here, it really points to the heart of the matter, what it means to have a heart after God's own heart really looks like. See, the heart of worship was bound to obedience. The heart after God's own heart, which is the heart of worship, is one that's bound to obedience to the Lord. But not for obedience sake, but rather to please the Lord. Because you love the Lord so much, you will do anything to please the Lord. This was the heart of David. Let's look at this in more detail with a passage that is commonly seen as a great example of David's heart of worship. This passage is found in 2 Samuel chapter 6 in its entirety. Let's turn there real quickly to 2 Samuel chapter 6. Now it states, David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. On the ark they set the ark of God on a new cart, and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the new cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals, which is basically a bunch of different instruments that they used back then to worship the Lord. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, threshing meaning the falling floor, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God, because of the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverence act. Therefore God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. Now let's stop right there real quick and examine this real quickly. David comes in, he's bringing the ark of God, he's worshiping all the way through as he's bringing the ark of God back to the city of David, and something happens. And it says it was because of the reverence of this fellow right here who died. His name is Uzzah. Because of his reverence, he died. Okay? And David begins to get angry. Now let's see how this story continues. We see that David begins to fear God because of his wrath. It says in verse 9, David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, how can the ark of the Lord ever come to me? He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed and Edom, the Gittites. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed and Edom, the Gittites, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. So David, afraid of the accident, afraid of God's wrath, he left it somewhere else because he wanted to avoid God's wrath of what had happened. And wherever the ark was, there was great blessing. David saw this as an answer to his repentance, his changed heart, his actual show of fear of the Lord and reverence of the Lord. And so we continue in verse 12. Now King David was told, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed and Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God. So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed and Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he quickly sacrificed a bull and fattened calf. So you gotta take this into consideration. Basically, this king, as soon as he walks in, he bows down and sacrifice to the Lord. Brings sacrifice to the Lord in an act of worship. But here's the next point. He was wearing a linen ephod and was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and sounds of trumpets. An ephod, real quick, is basically a covering that covers the front of you that many priests wore as they sacrifice and worship the Lord. It's key to understand that, because in truth it's not that he's simply walking around half naked. He could have had a shirt on, but it's likely the ephod was all he wore underneath the shirt, or below the shirt, so he likely wore underwear in the ephod, and that was about it. He had no pants. It's possible that this was the great description, as we see as we continue through the verse of descriptions of this. Now, he continued his worship while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and sound trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from the window. Now, real quick background story of Michal. Michal basically is David's first wife. It's a wife of his youth, in truth. Because Michal is the woman that he marries right after he defeats Goliath. And when David defeats Goliath, basically he's about 13 years old. And he's a short little boy. Basically, this is the beginning. This is the first love ever. The woman that he loved from the very beginning. You could consider her like a childhood friend as well. So she basically was one of his closest people, just as Samuel's son was his best friend. So was Michal a very close friend to him, and was his wife since the beginning of his work with the Lord, since he was brought into his story. And we see now Michal, daughter of Saul, watched this from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offering and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israel. Both men and women and all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, here she comes again, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." With attitude, of course, because if you ever have seen this kind of comments, it's clearly with an attitude of great anger and a fight about to brew. Okay? So David said to Michal, in response to this, and you got to remember, she is the first love of his life. She is his first wife. And he says this to her in response to her statement. "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people, Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will come even more undignified than this. I'll be humiliated in my own eyes." So basically, David's stating right here, he does not care. In fact, he'll do even more than this for the Lord. They put him in position as king in the state of glory that she's describing. It was God who put him there. And that he, for the Lord, will literally be willing to do so much to a point that he will feel ashamed of himself. Then he continues by saying, "But these slave girls you spoke of, the slave girls that basically to Michal were like shaming him, making fun of him. He said, these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor before them." The slave girls who said nothing the entire time, they will hold him in honor. And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Okay, so after this, basically God curses Michal for her attitude and leaves her without children until the last of her days. So I want you guys to, I'm going to point out a few things in here that are important to understand. First, the reason why Uzzah had to die was because there were traditional ways of how to carry the ark of the Lord as a sign of reverence that we see in Numbers 4 and Numbers Numbers chapter 4, verse 15, and Numbers chapter 7, verse 9. These two forms, they were not followed as the procession for celebration of the Lord's Ark coming to the city of David, which was David in charge of. So David held part of the blame of this irreverence. It's described as this. In verse 15 it states, after Aaron and his sons have finished covering the holy furnishings and all the holy artifacts, and when the camp is ready to move, only then are the Kohathites to come and do the carrying. But they must not touch the holy things or they will die. The Kohathites are to carry those things that are in the tent of the meeting. Okay? So right here, we see that Uzzah actually previously in 2 Samuel 6 actually touched the arks as he was trying to make sure it wouldn't fall. You weren't supposed to do that. You were actually supposed to hold on to the coverings around the ark to make sure it would not fall. In other words, you were supposed to carry that in of itself. We actually even say that very description in chapter 7. It says, chapter 7, verse 9 in Numbers says, but Moses did not give any of the Kohathites any. So verse 8 actually says that Moses was passing out to all these people, groups within the Levites, bulls and calves and all this kind of stuff. But Moses did not give it to the Kohathites. And it says, because they were to carry on their shoulders the holy things for which they were responsible. So to the very beginning, they were supposed to put the ark of the Lord, the things of the holy tent, the ark of the Lord, in the cart. They were supposed to carry it on their shoulders. And they did not do this. This was also an act of irreverence before the Lord. Now, these two things were acts of sins and disrespect to the Lord. Okay? Now, there were several different points that we get in this story. Now, understanding this background of how that accident happened, we can see a few things. The first thing is the overwhelming and unapologetic bold joy for the Lord's arrival in his presence that David presents at the very end of the story. It was such a joy that he humbled himself below the station of king to worship the King of Kings, to the point that he would rebuke his own wife, his greatest love, the oldest love he's ever had, the love he's had since he was 13 years old, before all his struggles, for stating that he was making a fool of himself and should never do so again. He said, I will always be a fool for the Lord. He was not scared. He was bold in joy that he would be a fool for the Lord no matter what, even if he was a king. It was like stating he was the greatest man in the world. He was the most powerful man in the world at that moment. He was the most powerful man in that nation with the greatest glory, the highest position. He could have all the pride he wants. He was the highest position in entire Israel, the most well-known, a great hero, a king, and he humbled himself to the point that he said he would make himself a fool if it's the sake of worshiping and praising the name of the Lord. Okay? That tells us a lot about his attitude for the Lord, right? A lot about his attitude, it's in his heart that makes him a man after God's own heart. Now the second is that he messed up. He sinned. He had disobeyed the traditional law of respect of the Lord in the way David chose to transport the ark, and the consequence was the death of a man named Uzzah. And because of this, he was afraid of the Lord. He was afraid of God's wrath because he knew that he had made a mistake, that he was responsible for this as well. And the third is that he repented of his sin and obeyed to the point that he did a full 180 in his attitude. We see that when you are walking in the second portion of bringing in the ark, now everything was changed. It was no longer in a cart. It was now being carried by these individuals that were supposed to carry the ark on their shoulders, and it was walked into the city of David. And as soon as it walked into, literally 6 steps in, David throws down an ephod and sacrifices 2 things to the Lord and begins to dance and worship in a ceremonial dance that was likely known at the time, as we see that there was a name, the passage for it. But he does it without any shame. He does a 180, 100% repentant heart and does everything he can, now knowing what he needs to do to respect and worship the Lord. Now, later on in chapter 7, we see the consequence, what rewards God gave David due to this. So it says in chapter 7, after the king was settled, his palace, and the Lord had given him rest, and I mean 2 Samuel chapter 7, after the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan, the prophet, "Here I am living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." So automatically the first thing he tells David is, "You're right, do what you want, God is with you. God is with you, you're good, do what you're going to do." But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan the prophet, saying to Nathan, okay? So at this point, the first thing after every piece comes up, after everything's done, David has had his rest, the first thing he says to the prophet is, "Look at me, I'm in the palace, something's not right here. I'm in the palace, filled with all this luxury, but where's God? God is in a tent. We need to fix this." And Nathan answers, "You're right, God's with you, take care of this." Okay? So the first response David has, as soon as he's victorious, as soon as he's resting, after everything's done, after a lot of wars, his first response is, "Let's build a temple." How many of us really would have that kind of attitude? Let's be honest. How many of us would in fact have this attitude? The first thing that we would think of after everything's done, after we've rested, is to build a house of the Lord to worship. The first thing we do is, now that we've reached the pinnacle of our success, our biggest dreams, let's say our dreams was to be the president or a basketball player or a top-ranking musician or a great scientist that won a Nobel Prize or something along those lines, that you reach the highest honors. And you're now rested, you've rested for a few days, and your first thought is, "You know what? Let me build a house of the Lord because I'm here. I got all this. It's not right. Let's fix this. Let's give a house of the Lord for the Lord because this is not right." Many of us, that would not be our first thought like it was for David. We see another component of what it means to have a heart after God's own heart. It was always in his mind to first please God. That was his first priority. And God responds to him later on, tell David basically in the next couple of verses that he is not the one that's supposed to build this. Stop him. Tell David, stop. I love your heart, but it's not for you to build the temple of the Lord. It's not for you to build my house, which we later on know that it was for Solomon to build the temple of the Lord. And then he tells David a blessing, seeing the response of David's heart by stating the following. The Lord declares to you, the Lord himself will establish a house for you when your days are over and you rest with your ancestors. I will raise up your offering to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of the kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with a rod, wielded by men. The flogging inflicted by human hands, by my love, will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. And David responds to this promise and this blessing from the Lord with great reverence and begins to worship him, stating, who am I to deserve this? He literally says in verse 18, in response to this, who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of yours, the future of the house of your servant, and this decree, sovereign Lord, is for me a mere human. What more can David say to you? For you know your servant, sovereign Lord, for the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. How great you are, sovereign Lord. There is no one like you, and there is no God but you, as we have heard with our own ears. And he continues going on, praising the Lord for the rest of the chapter until verse 29. Continues for several verses, just praising the Lord in shock and honor, in awe that God actually did this for him. So we need to understand God's response to him was based on his heart. It was clear that to David, both in praise and before praise, before the blessing and after the blessing, David was always worshiping the Lord. It was his first reaction. And the reason why that is that David's first thought was to do this simple fact was that he desired to put God first above all things, before his wife, before his own life, before his kingdom, before his own pride, before his own worth, before his fame, before his wealth. It clearly demonstrated and this is clearly demonstrated in Psalms 27, verse 4, where he says one thing, and this is while he's being chased. He's literally been taken out of his throne. He's being chased by his enemies. And it says, one thing I ask from the Lord. In this entire time, one thing he's asking from the Lord. This only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. So basically, he's stating right here, in a lament, basically he's in pain. He's suffering. He's basically being kicked out of his throne. He's being chased by some of his close confidants. And his first response, the only thing he really wants, the only thing he's really asking the Lord, is that he may be able to spend the rest of the days praising him, worshiping him, to be with him, to be in his presence. This is the heart of worship. A heart centered on worship is one that seeks out no matter what your situation is. Even if, for example, you lose your job. You out of nowhere lost your job. You have nothing to stand on. You have no future. You were the top. You have won all these awards. And for your faith, you were fired. And now you're struggling for your faith because of your faith. And your first response is, one thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. And that's an attitude we all should apply to ourselves. He only desired to be worshiping the Lord in his presence for the rest of his days. That's the only desire he had. To be with God in his presence, worshiping him, praising him, regardless of the circumstances. Does this kind of attitude remind you of anything? Something that's actually mentioned in the New Testament. Maybe this came up to you. And if it did, you are correct. It's carrying the cross. This is what Jesus discusses and explains as carrying the cross. To carry a cross is a common phrase in many churches and sermons. But have you ever really thought why and what it really means at its core? It is something so vital that in the New Testament it appears around literally 55 times. It is mentioned 55 times in the New Testament. So what do you think it really means? It connects to this thing that David is doing in Psalms 27:4. In Psalms 27:4, we see a heart that only wants to worship the Lord regardless of circumstances. What do you really think it means? A very good definition is seen in Matthew Henry's Bible commentary, which says, we often meet with crosses in the way of duty, and though we must not pull them upon our own heads, yet when they are laid for us, we must take them up and carry them after Christ. It is well or ill with us, according to as it is well or ill with our souls. The body cannot be happy if the soul is miserable in the other world, but the soul may be happy through the body is greatly, even though the body is greatly affected and oppressed in this world. We must never be ashamed of Christ and his gospel. The main point of this is to worship the Lord, to follow him regardless of circumstances, knowing the overflowing joy of the Lord will overcome our circumstances. Whether we've lost our jobs, whether we're sick and dying, whether we're beat for our faith, we should walk forward with Christ. This is an example of life of worship. Taking up the cross that Jesus asked us to take up is an act of worship. It's basically living a life of worship. if you're carrying your cross, if you're willing to take on the shame, to be ridiculed by your friends, by your family, to lose your job for the Lord, this is an act of worship to the Lord. It's a deep act of worship to the Lord that Jesus asks us to do, that he mentions 55 times in the New Testament to point out how important this concept really is. This just reminds you of David's life. In fact, it's this not exactly what he was doing in his entire life. If you see from beginning to end, just the first mention in the story of Goliath, everybody was scared. And David was like, they're making fun of Jesus. They're making fun of God. How can you guys stand here? He may be 10.5 feet tall, and I may just be like 4 feet tall, 13-year-old, incapable of carrying a sword or having armor on, but I'm going to fight for Jesus. I ain't got to let them disrespect Jesus. I'm going to stand for my faith, let them mock me, and Jesus got my back. I'm going to go face Goliath. What did he do when he faced Saul? Multiple times he was like, God is great. Let God's anointed one do what he needs to do because he's God's anointed one. And we'll discuss that and point that out in more detail later. But the lifestyle of worship is one that is required to those who follow Christ. To truly live a life of worship is to carry your cross. By doing so, we create a song for the Lord with every step we take in our life. With every step as we run through the race, as Paul describes it, we're basically singing a song to the Lord. But a lifestyle of worship is one that is required of those who follow Christ. The steps of song of worship is required. In fact, one could say Saul lost God's favor for not living such a life of worship. It is so important that in Luke 14:27, Christ stated, and whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. If one does not carry the cross, they cannot be a disciple of Jesus. They cannot be a follower of Jesus. They cannot be a true Christian, someone who's truly known by Jesus. They be the person that when they come up to heaven and have done all these things, and they ask Jesus, and Jesus tell them, "Get away from me, for I never knew you." They are those who God says, "I never knew you." Because think of it, Saul did a lot of things for God, but he never lived a life of worship. And God basically told him, "I don't know you. You don't know me. Our relationship is broken up. I'm done with you. I'm choosing a man after my own heart rather than your own." If one does not carry their cross, they cannot be a disciple of Jesus. Which leaves a question. Are you carrying your cross on a daily basis? Are you making an effort to live a life for Jesus? Are you making an effort to live a life of worship? The truth is that living a life of worship, which we carry the cross every day, is truly a difficult thing to do. It's not easy. It's not easy. For the challenges of life can often distract us, can often cripple us. So the key is found in our focus. In our focus, where do we look at? Where are we focusing our eyes at? Where are we focusing our heart at? Are we focusing our views on our situations, on our struggles of life? Are we focusing everything on what's going on around us, our money, our family, our friends? Is that where our focus is, or is it on Jesus? We see an excellent example of where our focus should be when we read the story in 1 Samuel 24 in the life of David, which is actually seen where basically Saul discovered where David's at. At this point, David's on the run because Saul wants to kill David. He wants to murder David because Saul doesn't trust David and he's gone crazy, cuckoo, basically demon-possessed. And he found out David is hiding in this area. So he takes his entire army to come and kill David. And out of nowhere, earthly needs come to Saul, and he stops his army and says, "Guys, I'm going to take a leak over here in this cave." Little did Saul know, David and his men were hiding in the same cave. Okay? So, the men of David come and say, "David, here's Saul by himself with his pants down. It's time. We can kill him. We can get rid of this. We can finally be free." And David is tempted by this. He's tempted by this situation because if he kills Saul, then no one's going to hunt him down because the one that wants David dead is Saul. If Saul's dead, then David's free, right? So, self-defense kills Saul. But this is what David actually does. When David comes close, he sneaks behind Saul while Saul's doing his business. And Saul's about to get killed because David has his sword ready. Instead of killing him, he cuts a mantle of Saul's robe. He stops himself and cuts a mantle of Saul's robe. And he felt so guilty at just simply cutting the mantle of Saul's robe. Because he knew Saul was God's anointed. God had anointed Saul. And he saw this as a disrespect and disobedience to God. He couldn't kill Saul. Because to kill Saul, the God's anointed, is to stand against God and God's will. So when Saul leaves the cave, David comes out, rushes out, and he tells Saul, "You came here to kill me, and I had a chance to murder you. You were there in the cave, and I could kill you. Here's the mantle to prove it. I cut a piece of your robe. Here's the proof to prove it. I could have killed you. I didn't kill you because you're God's anointed." And Saul saw David's act of worship and how he treated him so much better than Saul had ever treated him, and said, "You are a better man than me," and left with his army. David's act of worship literally changed his circumstance. Because you have to understand, Saul was literally a man who basically was demonically possessed at this point. In fact, there's several passages where Saul was demonically possessed with stress, evil spirits came in, and David had to come in and worship the Lord so that evil spirits would be calmed within Saul. Saul was not right in his mind, and he was set on killing David. And when David presents this act of worship to the Lord, it was so impactful to Saul, the enemy of David, that David showed him mercy in the time that he should have killed him in human means. By human standard, Saul deserved to die. He had done everything to deserve to die, according to Scripture. He had done everything. He tried to murder him. He chased him out. He made him out to be a criminal when he was innocent. Saul was basically a tyrant. And David gave him mercy out of an act of worship. See, the reason for this is that David's focus in the entire situation that he was living in, as he escaped, as he was chased down, being murdered by Saul, being ostracized, being cast out of his own homeland, having to live among enemies, the enemy nations that he fought against, specifically the Philistines, who were the people who Goliath was a part of, who him murdered, and Goliath was a champion of those people. He had to live amongst them, hiding and fighting them from time to time. But rather than the focus of his situation, it was on the Lord. See, he so loved the Lord that he let go of his circumstances, let go of his greatest enemy, and show him the love of Christ. In so doing, many things changed. So when we leave here today, when you leave here today, if you leave this message, if after you finish watching the video, let's remember, let's keep this in mind as you leave, to change our focus to worship the Lord rather than stay in our situation. Let's change our focus instead of our situations, the storms of our life, much like Peter did when he was walking on water. He saw the wind and he began to sink instead of staring at Jesus that was right in front of him, walking and standing in the water like nothing was going on. Instead of losing our focus because of the situations, the winds that are passing through us in our lives, we should change our focus to worshiping God and praying the Lord will help us to do so. We should pray every day that God gives us the strength and the spiritual maturity to walk in faith with him, carrying our cross. Asking him that if we stumble while carrying our cross, he picks us back up and helps us stand back up. We should keep that in mind and pray that this be so for the rest of our life, guys. I pray this blessed you, and if it did, I hope you click the like button and subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment if you have any questions at all. If this blesses you, I would love to hear your comments. If you have any questions, I would love to respond to them. And if you want any prayer requests, if you need help in praying for this lifestyle of carrying the cross, a lifestyle of worship, please leave a comment. I would love to add you to my prayer list. Have a wonderful and blessed day, guys.